And so we embarked on a whole series of work that started to look at how we behaved, and we started to make the culture of the organisation much more restorative. And as that culture of restorative leadership came into place, which was significantly challenging, we had to change how we behaved. We had to listen really carefully to what children were saying, to what families were saying, to what our staff were saying, and change our behaviours so that we empowered individuals to be able to work in a very different way. And what we have seen are the outcomes that Nigel showed you in his presentation.
Thanks, I'm so glad I asked you that question. Perhaps we can move to Sharon and just pick up on the family group conferencing, and are you happy to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of that? And I think particularly how families and children are engaged in that process and start to take control over the decisions that are made about their lives.
Yeah, sure. So our traditional responses to child welfare issues in the UK are things like child protection conferences, so professionally led meetings where you might have 10, 12, 15 professionals coming together from a multi-agency across the board to talk about the child and the presenting problem. Parents are invited, but they're generally held in state buildings, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Often parents can't attend, or if they do, it might just be mum. And I just want you to think about how that might feel for a parent. So coming to an office to be told, this is what we're worried about, these are the concerns that probably are your fault, and what are you going to do about it? So that's a very cynical view of how child protection conferences are. I think that's probably well backed up in evidence, and also experiences of the families that I've worked with over the years. And I want you to think now about what would we, if we're going to do it differently, and if we're going to take all of those values that Estelle's been talking about, and Nigel's been talking about turning some of this stuff on its head, what would it look like if we looked at the people who are really around a child? And going back to Michelle's slide about there's a child in the centre, there are carers, and then there's a whole community who know and care for the child. What if we were to say to those people, how do you see this problem? What do you think the solutions might be? What resources do you think might be helpful? And the people who bring that together are the social workers. So a family group conference is taking that traditional model of decision making, which is entirely professionally led for us, and give it back to the family. And not just throw them in a room and say, get on with it, but actually give them some support and resources to meet together, to think about how their meeting might be. You know, Nigel's point about one size doesn't fit all, one size fits one. Every single family has a different culture. Every single family would identify themselves differently. So my sister might identify that side of my family because that's who she feels supported by. I might identify my family as that side of my family and that side of my family. So approaching families as the experts in their own situation, and really as people who are worth doing business with, rather than people that we can take a little bit from to stick our plaster here, but actually get people together in a really planned way. The process is quite long. It takes 4 to 6 weeks to prepare for a family group conference, and that involves a coordinator going out, working alongside that family within their culture to think about what their meeting is going to look like. You can imagine if you turn the power dynamics entirely on their head around the way in which we make decisions, the decisions that and plans that come out of those meetings are entirely different to what we're used to, but they're highly successful.
Okay, great. Thanks for that explanation. I want to take a slightly different tack, and this is a question that anybody can pick up, but Nigel, you might want to pick it up on it first. We've talked a little bit about the involvement of children, and we've talked certainly about family in its broadest context. And we've talked about that in the context of both schools. Estelle's talked about it in a school context, and we've talked about it in the context of statutory child welfare departments. I'm interested, in part because when you look up at this slide up, not slide, but this banner up here, you see a lot of names of organisations which sort of sit outside of the statutory systems, that sit outside of the government system, NGOs as we call them here, third sector I think you might call them in the UK. I'm interested about how those civil society organisations have got engaged in the processes that you've been involved in, and how important they've actually been in that journey.
Shall I start? Have a go? Okay, so critical is the short answer. Absolutely critical to the story that I've just shared with you. And I would say that both in terms of the relationships that we were building in Hull, but hugely important players in terms of the story I've just told you about Leeds. And the feedback we got from, and I'm using the language third sector because that's the language how we would describe it, but NGO works as well. The feedback that we got from them was, well, thank goodness. Thank goodness at last we know what we're all trying to do, and we're going to stick to it. And they were part of the brokering of a whole series of what-if conversations around the city to come up with the child-friendly city ambition, to come up with the 5 outcomes, to come up with the 12 priorities, to come up with the 3 obsessions. They're part of that architecture that I said from the top table. They've got a seat at the top table, but they also are represented in those local clusters that we talked about, the 25 across the city, and they are invited to the discussions within those clusters. They're part and parcel of that, to talk about what's going on, how much did we do, how well did we do it, is anybody any better off? They're just critical, and as a resource again that historically we probably weren't using very well, because we weren't very clear about what we wanted people to do, or we didn't understand the organisations well enough to understand their capacity to help with the 3 obsessions, the 12 priorities, the 5 outcomes. Once that plan on a page was there, people came forward saying, we can do that, we know how to work in that way, we can help you with in terms of improved outcomes for a particular group. So it entirely changed the nature of the relationship with us. And they were the funny story, I suppose, is we had third sector organisations that were queuing up to want to talk to the inspectors when they arrived, because they were so passionate about how engaged they felt in terms of improving the life chances of the next generation of their city. And people got very grumpy with us if they didn't get a slot with the inspectors, I think. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, just, I think...
we've got duets now.
Eh?
Duets? You start singing, you sing the first chorus.
No. Got to stand up to your boss.
The control I have. It was the same about finance.
The answer is always no. Go Sal.
I think one of the things that's really important to understand about some of what we achieved was the whole system approach to things. And one of the things that we talked about very bravely, I think, was that when people contact Children's Services or the local authority and they've got a concern about a child, what a lot of organisations and certainly some of the regulators are very keen on is this idea of threshold, about a line that is drawn somewhere, and at that point it suddenly becomes a statutory responsibility or a non-statutory responsibility. And we decided that we would ban thresholds. We wouldn't use them, because if you have a threshold and you draw a line somewhere, all the people that are underneath it are trying desperately to prove to you that it goes over the line, and anybody who's over the line is trying desperately to prove to you that it sits underneath the line. And so all of the conversations between professionals and others becomes about the threshold, not about children's needs. And once you start to think about the conversations being about children's needs, you spend some time discussing what the child's needs are, and at the end of that conversation, the conversation turns to, now that we understand the needs of this child, who is best placed to to have that first conversation with the family? Because it might not be a social worker, actually. That might frighten a vulnerable mother away from services. It might be the person that works in the children's centre, who's got a relationship, who's got trust, because we understand the issues. They have that first conversation, mum engages in a way that we might have actually disengaged her with a different response. And so the importance of the whole system and each component's importance in their responsibility in it becomes central to what you are trying to do, and different parts of that system are able to have different conversations with families, but it's making sure that at the right time you have the right service that is going in, that's going to be the most effective.
Okay, great. Estelle, did you want to comment at all?
I was just going to say about working in partnership with health visitors, police and so on, and that we encourage the meetings at our school so we can do them in a restorative way, and people have responded really well to that.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to finish up with a question. It's the same question for each of you, and if we can just ask a really quick response. We're running somewhat over time, but people don't mind actually waiting for their morning tea in Adelaide, so it's not too problematic. And the question is, what's the one factor that you could actually put your finger on that has actually been most critical to support the sort of reforms that you have helped to lead in your particular domain? So if there was one thing that really made the difference, that was the impetus to actually enable it to occur, and I hope to take it in any order, so if that question isn't too oblique. Sal, you're busting to answer, aren't you?
So I'll go to Mahatma Gandhi, who said, be the change you want to see in the world. So I think for me personally, it was very much about being prepared to change myself before having the expectation of everybody else changing, because it's easy to kind of say, you lot down there need to change. But actually, unless you do that change yourself, then I don't think you've got the credibility to create the change that you need to.
Okay, great.
I'd echo that actually. Having worked with families for 25 years, you would probably think that I would say it's got to start at a grassroots level, and I've been banging my head against that particular brick wall for the past 25 years. But one of the things that Leeds did differently was to have some humility, and Nigel said, you know, hero leadership is over. When you begin to implement restorative practices, you invite leaders to make the change first, because until they've made the change, nobody else is going to. There will always be a reason why not to. And you might have pockets of really good practice, but until those people who have the power are willing to look at that power, then there's very little hope of wide-scale change.
For me, it was sitting with the community of the school and agreeing what the shared values were going to be in a very with process, so that they were on board right from the beginning, and this was a shared mission, not just my idea.
And I'd extend that and say, looking back on it, it is that plan on the page. It's the collective agreement around the vision that was brokered, and it took a lot of work, it took a lot of conversations. It's quite hard to make just stick to one page. The temptation is to make it more complicated and add loads and loads of subsections and other chapters and all the rest of it. But trying to get that clarity of purpose, and probably the most inspiring bit of feedback that I received in the whole time I was in Leeds was that it generated a feeling of hope, that there was something that people could commit to, and they knew this, if they had committed to it properly and they bought into it, it was going to make a fundamental difference to the life chances of the next generation in Leeds.
Fantastic. Thank you for those insightful and very succinct responses. The panel that you've just heard from are going to feature in two of the breakout sessions, one before lunch and one after lunch. So I suspect many in the room will want to actually participate in those, but there are other sessions that will be happening too, and we'd like you to spread out so you don't have to get to the first one. There will be two opportunities to interact with the quartet that have just been up on the stage today, and for you to ask your own questions. But for now, I wonder if you can join me in thanking them.